Ethan said I was an arrogant queen who had humiliated him with money for 7 years. Yet when he knelt down to accept my sponsorship back then, he didn't say a word. Now I've returned to that day. His childhood sweetheart cried with tears streaming down her face, shouting, "We don't need your filthy money." I smiled as I tore the check into pieces. Don't get me wrong, I'd rather burn this money than waste it on you. The shredded pieces of the check fluttered through the air, scattering on the ground like the love I once humiliated myself to offer. I knew what would come next. Isabella would throw herself at Ethan, sobbing dramatically, while Ethan stood silently, refusing to even glance my way. But this time, I wasn't going to retreat, nor was I going to lower myself again. When I looked up, I saw a face both familiar and foreign staring back at me. Seeing Isabella clinging to Ethan, I felt dazed meeting Ethan's gaze at 20. Ethan still had that youthful look dressed in a faded denim jacket, but he was stunningly handsome, tall and upright, with sharp features. His eyes sparkled like cold stars, making even his worn clothes seem distinguished. I couldn't help but take a step back, bracing myself against the table to steady my stance. How long had it been since I'd seen Ethan like this? 10 years, or maybe 20, too long. I couldn't remember anymore. After all, that was all in a past life. Ethan paused, surprised, as he saw me step back. Isabella continued to ramble on, but I couldn't hear a thing. Everything in front of me was exactly as it had been in my past life. Just like before, he didn't want my sponsorship, and I stubbornly insisted on giving it to him. I'd liked Ethan for 7 years, and I knew he came from a difficult background. His father was a hopeless gambler who, after losing all his money, would come home drunk and beat him and his mother. Ethan's mother, unable to bear the abuse, eventually took her own life. Since childhood, Ethan had scraped by collecting trash, working odd jobs, and relying on scholarships to get by in school. Under normal circumstances, our paths wouldn't have crossed, but he always did well academically and in high school. The private school I attended gave him a scholarship to boost its admission rates, and that's how we ended up in the same school. Everyone in our circle came from wealthy families and had no interest in studying. We drifted through each day just waiting to go abroad, earn a degree, and come back to take over the family business. But Ethan was different. He had clear goals, studied hard during class, and went to work right afterward. Though he had no money, he never seemed embarrassed about it. He was always dignified, never feeling less than anyone else. That's when I fell for him. I liked him, so I couldn't bear to see him suffer. At that young age, I was naive, constantly forcing everything I could thought was good onto him. When he didn't have time to eat breakfast because he worked late, I'd bring him a lunchbox from home. Ethan, our family cook, makes the best beef, try some, and here's some foie gras. My dad had it flown in especially. It's delicious as an only spoiled. I was spoiled having grown up with everyone around me catering to my whims. I just wanted to give him the best of everything, but I completely overlooked whether he wanted any of it. Our classmates teased Leona. He probably doesn't even know what foie gras is. Haha, he probably can't even afford chicken liver. I snapped back at them. Mind your own business. I didn't notice Ethan's fingers turning white as he gripped the lunchbox tightly. After a pause, he returned the lunchbox to me and said coldly, "Thanks, but no thanks, but no thanks." "Come on, Ethan," a boy chimed in with a smirk. "If you get with Leona, you never have to work hard again. Go ahead, make a move. Yeah, then your dad could gamble all he wants without worrying about your tuition." Everyone burst out laughing. I slammed my hand on the table. "Shut up, all of you." They stopped laughing, but Ethan abruptly stood up and left. I chased after him, trying to hand him the lunchbox. "Ethan, ignore them. Just eat something. If you keep working like this, you'll wear yourself out." He stopped and spun around. I froze. His eyes were filled with nothing but hate and contempt. Teenagers have short memories. I soon forgot about that incident and kept pestering Ethan for him. I even started studying seriously so we could attend the same university. My father was thrilled, doubling my allowance in college. Ethan became even busier. He didn't qualify for financial aid, and his spot for a hardship stipend was taken by a classmate with connections. At his worst, he could only afford a single steamed bun each day, filling up on free soup. I couldn't bear to see it and offered to support him, but he refused. He worked 3-part 2-time jobs, eventually collapsing from exhaustion on the street. I couldn't stand it anymore and forced money on him. Ethan, why won't you take my money? Why are you pushing yourself so hard? I went to his aviso and paid his tuition without telling him. By then, I had learned a bit more and knew to consider his pride, so I'd always bring extra food, saying I couldn't finish it so he'd share with me when we went out. I'd claim I'd gotten free tickets and drag him along. Gradually, Ethan and I seemed to be growing closer. I continued supporting him until he graduated. I even sponsored his childhood friend to make him happy. After graduation, Ethan started his own business. He was a top student, and while still in school, he'd worked with friends to develop a game software, but he couldn't find any investors. Seeing him so downcast, I eventually asked my dad to invest in this project. I remember that night, Ethan was unusually quiet as I leaned against his shoulder, nearly drifting off. He suddenly asked Leona, "Why do you do all this?" thinking he was finally acknowledging my kindness. I replied confidently, "Because I like you." "Ethan, do you like me?" I tugged on his arm playfully. "I've been so good to you. If you still won't be with me, you'd be utterly heartless." Back then, I was only half joking, but when Ethan didn't respond, I took it as silent consent, and just like that, we ended up together. 2 years later, Ethan and I got married. Our wedding was a simple affair. Ethan didn't want too many people, so we only invited a few close family and friends. All of them were mine, on his side. He came alone after the wedding. Ethan remained distant. I was foolish back then, thinking he was just naturally reserved. Since I had chased him for so long, I thought that if I kept being good to him, I could eventually melt his heart. But I didn't expect him to be as cold as stone, because all along his heart belonged to someone else. In the 3rd year of our marriage, our conflicts became irreconcilable. I couldn't stand his endless indifference and questioned him about his feelings for his childhood friend. He only looked at me coldly, saying nothing. When I pressed harder, he simply stormed out, driven to the edge by his silent treatment. I became more obsessive and confrontational every time he returned. I demand answers, shout, and sometimes lose control during our worst fights. If I had known you'd turn out to be such a thankless wretch, I'd have rather raised a dog. It would at least wag its tail at me. For a moment, his face twisted with rage, but he quickly regained his composure. After that day, he stopped coming home altogether. Later, I found out he had long been with his childhood friend. They had made a new home together, and even had a child. In those years, he had a happy, complete family outside, and I was left alone in a cold, empty house with all the love I had turned into poison, seething with bitterness. Ethan's business took off, and he became wealthier than my father ever was. I have nothing to retaliate against him with. The only thing I have left is my marriage. I'm putting my life on the line to get back at him. Even if he offered me all the money in the world, I would die before divorcing him.
He ruined me, so I won't let him live comfortably either.
The woman he loves will always be the hidden third party, someone who can't see the light of day. And his son with another woman will always be an illegitimate child destined to stay in the shadows. Ethan wouldn't dare take me to court. He's afraid that a public divorce dispute would impact the company's stock price. The other board members wouldn't allow it either, and so I dragged it out with him for 10 years. During those 10 years, no matter how much I broke down, how mad I went, even when I eventually humbled myself and begged him, he never softened. Not once did he come back to see me. In the endless cycle of despair, I withered away, my health deteriorating to a severe state. Eventually, I died in sorrow and bitterness. "Leona," a voice snapped me back to reality, and I looked over at Ethan. A profound hatred surged through my entire being. My heart felt like it was about to burst. For a moment I could hardly stand, after my death. He finally got what he wanted, didn't he? Perhaps he treated me that way in the first place, to drive me to an early grave. I still remember how my medication was suddenly swapped. When I asked the butler, he simply said it was changed to something milder. I didn't think anything of it, but shortly after taking it, my health began deteriorating rapidly, until I couldn't even sit up any. Not long after I breathed my last. It was him, wasn't it? Who else would hate me so much? Who else would want me dead so badly? He wanted to raise Isabella to his level? What a twisted plan. I looked at Ethan, struggling to suppress the urge to leap at him and kill him on the spot. I hate him so much, except for being a little naive when I was younger and not respecting his pride enough. I don't believe I wronged Ethan in any way. I didn't even force him to marry me. I had even asked him if he was willing, telling him that if he wasn't, I'd be willing to wait. But he ended up hating me this much, just like in my previous life. Isabella started taunting me. Leona, do you think money makes you superior? What right do you have to look down on people like this? I looked at her dressed in a white dress. She appeared delicate and fragile, like a little white flower. This was the woman Ethan loved, the one he would rather kill me than allow her to take my place. My past life, it was the same. I was calmly discussing with Ethan that if he felt uncomfortable, he could pay me back the tuition money. Once he started making money, I told him to think of it as a loan. But Isabella suddenly accused me of throwing money around to humiliate him, claiming I was insulting Ethan. Later, during arguments with Ethan, I gradually realized he always felt I was throwing money at him, humiliating him. It was ridiculous watching Isabella's protective stance. I smirked. You're overthinking it. I'd rather burn this money than use it to support you too. Ethan's face immediately changed. Isabella's expression blinked for a moment. What did you say? I smiled. Didn't you feel that my support was an insult? After all, we're classmates. I wouldn't want to humiliate you like that. So let's forget it. You two can keep working to support yourselves. Isabella's family situation was similar to Ethan. Her father had run off with a pile of debt, and her mother, who had fallen ill from working to support her, could now only lie at home. Perhaps it was due to their shared misfortune that she and Ethan had always been close. She was constantly by his side. She loved tagging along whenever I went out with Ethan. When I sometimes preferred not to take her, she would hide behind him with a pitiful look and ask Leona, "Is it because I'm poor? Do you not want to be friends with me?" Before I could say anything, Ethan would shield her, saying sternly, "If you think we're not good enough, then don't come with us." I had no choice but to bring her along. She would be there at every meal. She would look at the lobster on her plate, tilting her head and saying, "Do you eat like this every day?" Then, with a wistful, envious tone, she would add, "We really live in two different worlds." There were times when Ethan and I were having a perfectly good conversation, but as soon as she made a comment like that, his expression would change. He would stop talking to me, his smile gone at first. I thought she was just being thoughtless. Until one day, when I was walking with Ethan, I turned back to say something to him and caught the look in her eyes. Isabella's face was expressionless, but her eyes were filled with malice and resentment. When she saw me turn, she hurriedly forced a smile, but a chill ran down my spine. Only then did I realize she hated me, or rather, she despised me. In the early days of my marriage to Ethan, we did have a brief period of harmony. His company was starting to gain traction and had just landed its first big contract at the celebration party. He drunkenly wrapped an arm around me, smiling as he said, "Baby, what do you want? Your husband will buy it for you," feeling sorry for how hard he worked. I held him contentedly. "No need. As long as you care, that's enough for me." But he insisted stubbornly, saying a husband earns money to spend on his wife. "I'm getting you a handbag. Tell me which one you like." Even as he drifted off to sleep, he kept mumbling, "Leona, I have money now, you don't have to suffer with me any." True to his word, he bought me a bag the next day. But before I could even react, Isabella showed up. She looked at the bag in my hand with an odd expression. Then she snatched it from me, laughing as she turned to Ethan and said, "Well, I remember Leona had this bag back in college. Some guy who liked her gave it to her, didn't he?" She thought it was too cheap back then and didn't want to carry it around. I had long forgotten if that was true, but Ethan's face instantly darkened. He took the bag, walked out expressionlessly, and left when I saw that bag again. It was on Isabella's shoulder with a smirk. She casually said, "Leona, Ethan gave me this bag. You don't mind, right?" Of course I minded, and I demanded she return it. She looked panicked, her eyes welling up with tears as she asked, "You already have so many bags. Why fight me over this one?" "You have so much, and I only have this one." Ethan pulled me away with a grim look. "Let go if you didn't care about it." Why fight with her? Or do you only want what others have? I was too proud to tolerate this, and we had a huge fight. It was only later that I understood Isabella wasn't talking about the bag. She was talking about Ethan. She thought I'd stolen him from her, and that's why she hated me so deeply. Leona Ethan suddenly grabbed my arm in a panic. Wait. I turned, stunned for a moment at the look on his face. There was an intense turmoil in his eyes, as if something inside him was about to break free. Even his voice was trembling. No, it's not supposed to be like this, Leona. Why won't you support me anymore? Don't you like me? I was startled by his desperation. What's wrong with Ethan? Has he gone mad? Is he upset because I didn't speak nicely to Isabella, but in my past life he was always so cold and distant, never showing a hint of emotion? Has he lost his mind? I tried to pull my hand away, let go of me, but he held on even tighter, his eyes red, rhymed. Leona, don't you like me anymore? Are you abandoning me now? I was genuinely scared. Ethan had never spoken to me like this before. My eyes widened in shock. Ethan, have you lost your mind or are you possessed? He said nothing, just stared at me intensely, his expression fanatical and unyielding. Anger flared up within me after everything he put me through in my past life. He still dares to glare at me. So all this time you felt humiliated by my support, Ethan? Or are you just shamelessly hoping I'll beg you to stay freeloading off me? Isabella gaped, shocked at the way I was speaking to him. Of course she was in my past life. This was what I liked him most. I'd carefully chosen every word, terrified of wounding his pride, but now I don't care anymore. Ethan, who do you think you are? I sneered with contempt. Heartless. Ungrateful. He's the worst kind of person. I can't believe I ever liked someone like that. Ethan, however, didn't get angry, as expected. His face went deathly pale, completely drained of color. I yanked my hand out of his grip and walked away without looking back. There's $200,000 in that card. I gave Ethan enough to cover his tuition and living expenses. I headed straight to the mall with that card. Better to buy myself a few bags than waste the money on him in my last life. Aside from that one bag, Ethan never got me anything. Birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, he could never remember. Or maybe he just didn't care. Yet Isabella somehow ended up as a wealthy wife, flapping her purchases everywhere. She would spend tens or even hundreds of thousands buying bags, watches, clothes, all with Ethan's. Each time she would parade her latest purchase in front of me. Leona Ethan got this from me from Paris. What did he get you? She'd stifle a laugh behind her hand or nothing at all. Then I would argue with Ethan, and our relationship would spiral even further downwards. Thinking back, I was wealthy. Why did I need a man to buy things for me? I could buy whatever I wanted. I ended up buying 4 bags with that $200,000 and still had $100,000 left over on my way back to campus. Wouldn't you know it? I ran into Ethan and Isabella as soon as I got off the bus. Isabella saw the luxury shopping bags I was carrying, and her expression changed. She couldn't hide her jealousy and bitterness at that point. Ethan was still flat broke, and so was she. Her white dress was so worn that the fabric was fraying, though she tried her best to trim the threads and iron it smooth. One glance, though, and you could tell it was a cheap knockoff from a street stall. Leona, you sure are rich. I noticed how fast Isabella could switch her attitude a moment ago. She was sneering at me, saying 2 pennies didn't make me special. Now she was addressing me all sweetly as Leona. She glared at the Chanel bags in my hand. Her fingers clenched tightly. A Chanel bag must be pricey, just one of those costs as much as a few years of our tuition. She leaned toward Ethan, saying pointedly, we really are from different worlds, before whenever she'd say things like that, I'd always try to argue back. But I was never good with words, and Ethan would only get Ari with the more. I said now I couldn't care less. I smiled faintly. I guess you're not just broke. You're not very smart either, did you? Only just figure that out? I live in a 300 square meters apartment downtown, and you live in a 30 square meters basement. Of course, we're not from the same world. Isabella's face turned green, her features twisted. For a moment, I walked over and spoke each word slowly, looking her in the eye. Isabella, you will never be in the same world as me. You'll just stay jealous your whole life. Ethan, she quickly switched tactics, trying to play the victim with him. I let out a derisive laugh. Is hiding behind a man all you know how to do, just like a bug crawling around in the dirt? Don't bother trying to lean on Ethan. Neither of you are any better than the other. Both equally disgusting after giving that disgusting pair a piece of my mind. I happily went home. It's not that I don't want revenge. I still remember how they drugged me in my past life. But first, the drugging hasn't happened in this life yet, so I have no proof. And second, I don't want to ruin my life over garbage like them being tormented. My whole last life was already miserable enough. This time around, I just want to stay as far away from them as possible. Whatever happens to them, good or bad, has nothing to do with me. I want a fresh start, but no matter how much I wanted to avoid them, those two were like lingering ghosts. A few days later, a friend came over with some shad and Frida saying since you didn't give Ethan and Isabella any money, they're really struggling. They can't even pay for their tuition. Ethan's been working non-SS top at parting time jobs and Isabella was trying to buy a new dress the other day. It was only $80, but even after maxing out all her cards, she couldn't scrape together enough. She even had to sell the phone you gave her to barely make the tuition payment. It took me a moment to remember. In my last life, I noticed Ethan's old phone was barely working, so I got him the latest model. The next day, I saw that phone in Isabella's hands. I looked down, mocking is that so they really are broke. I hadn't walked 2 steps before Isabella blocked my way. She was clearly upset and grabbed me angrily. Leona, why aren't you helping Ethan anymore? Don't you know he has the highest GPA in his major if he loses his chance because of tuition? Can you take that responsibility? I froze for a second, then couldn't help but laugh in disbelief. I finally realized what kind of people they were in my last life. They want other people's money, but can't bring themselves to ask politely, biting the hand that feeds them while they eat. It's shameless, really. What does he have to do with me? I spread my hands. I'm not his guardian, how can you say that? Isabella's voice grew louder as classmates who knew us gathered around and she played up her innocent act, even squeezing out a few tears as if she were courageously standing up to injustice. One of your bags costs more than several years of our tuition. What's so wrong with helping us out a little, or are you just that selfish, preferring to waste money rather than help those in need? She probably thought everyone was like Ethan, easily manipulated by her shameless logic. Before I could respond, my friend stepped in. Her family background is similar to mine, but her temper is much fiercer. She gave Isabella a mocking look and said, "Did an asylum forget to lock its doors and let you out? If you made money, you could beg or at worst, sell yourself. Even if you're a bit ugly, someone might still go for $80 a time, 10 times, and you've got 800,100 times, and you've got your tuition. You've got arms, legs, and kidneys, don't you? Why beg money from others like they owe you something?" Isabella was used to passive-aggressive jabs, but she wasn't prepared for this kind of direct hit. She was completely taken aback, speechless. Other classmates chimed in too. Yeah, if you're broke, you can always apply for scholarships. Asking people for money with that attitude, shameless. Honestly, no wonder she's broke with that behavior. She deserves it. Isabella took a step back, her eyes wide with disbelief. I chuckled. I often treat classmates to drink some meals, so naturally they stood by me. In hindsight, what did Isabella have besides Ethan? She couldn't hold a candle to me if it weren't for me being so infatuated with Ethan in my last life. Someone like her would never have even crossed my path. Just then, Ethan appeared. Isabella? She clung to him like he was her savior, her eyes brimming with tears. I only asked Leona to help you out a little. She has all that money for bags, but won't lend you a cent. I don't know what I did to upset her. She's been so awful to me. She immediately switched to a tearful face speaking to me. Leona, I know you look down on me, but I'm only thinking about Ethan. He's so outstanding, I was beyond disgusted. Isabella was like a leech you couldn't shake off, always clinging on and never letting go. Ethan's brows furrowed slightly. Did you insult her? I couldn't help but laugh mockingly. Of course he's always like this. The moment Isabella played the victim, he'd blindly scold me without hearing the full story. In the past, Every time this happened, I'd end up angry and hurt, yelling at him before crying alone in my room, but now not anymore. I raised my gaze to Ethan. Yeah, she's right. I did insult her unexpectedly. Ethan didn't get angry. He lowered his head, speaking softly, almost as if he was trying to appease me. It must be something she did to upset you, he said gently. Then he turned to Isabella and said in a calm tone, Leona isn't unreasonable. Apologize to her. I was stunned, genuinely wondering if I was still dreaming. Isabella was also taken aback, her lips trembling after a long silence. Ethan, what did you say? She stammered. Ethan's expression hardened. I told you to apologize. Isabella's eyes turned red and she took a step back in disbelief, her voice choked with emotion. How can you do this? I was just as baffled. Was Ethan actually making Isabella, the one he cherished most, apologize to me? Had he lost his mind? A fleeting thought crossed my mind. Could it be he was also reborn, but I quickly dismissed the notion? Impossible. In our past lives, Ethan had hated me so intensely that he even tried to poison me to death. If he had been reborn, he would have distanced himself from me at once. He must be plotting something else. I took a step back, eyeing him with caution. Ethan looked like he'd been pierced by my gaze, staring at me with a pained expression. Leona, I know I was wrong before. Will you forgive me? You used to like me, didn't you? Let's be together, okay? I'll make up for everything I owe you. His emotions grew more intense as he spoke, and by the end he was staring at me like I was something precious. He'd almost lost, his voice trembling slightly. This was absurd. I couldn't help but clench my fists. In my previous life, I had chased after him with all my heart, even sacrificing my dignity just to hear him say these words, but to the day I died, he never once said he loved me. Now, in this life, after I've cursed and humiliated him, he claims he loves me. Then what did all my efforts in my last life even mean? I sneered, disgust evident in my tone. Be with you, Ethan. Who do you think you are to be with me? Just one of my outfits would cost you 3 years of hard work. Delusional, what makes you think you can be with me? Didn't he think I was humiliating him? Well, let him experience true humiliation then. As expected, Ethan's face turned pale. I may not have money now, but if you wait, I'll be rich someday. He insisted that much was true. He would indeed be wealthy in the future. But what did that have to do with me? The hatred and disgust within me were nearly overwhelming. I looked at him with contempt. Ethan, even if every man on earth died, I wouldn't be with you. After I left that day, Ethan stood there in a daze, watching me leave. He looked utterly pitiful, shoulders slumped like his soul had been drained. All I felt was cold amusement. I didn't know what Ethan's angle was, whether he had suddenly seen the light or just lost his mind. It didn't matter. The Leona who once loved him so relentlessly had died in the last life. In this life, all I felt toward him was hatred. Without my financial support, Ethan and Isabella lived far worse than they had in our previous lives. Ethan's programming never sold, and his attempt at starting his own business failed. I heard they're so broke now, they're close to selling blood to make ends meet. But that's no longer my concern. The next morning, my phone rang. I picked it up and saw a name on the screen, Jerome. He was once my friend. For a moment, I felt disoriented. To me, it had been more than a decade since I'd seen these names. Back when I was with Ethan, he disliked my friends from wealthy families and wouldn't let me associate with them. Gradually, I drifted away from them. Jerome was the person Isabella had accused of giving me handbags. Our families had known each other for generations, and we'd been close since we were kids. When I answered the call, his excited voice came through the phone. Leona, I heard you finally told that little punk Ethan off. I hadn't even said a word before. He added excitedly about time someone put him in his place, living off you and messing with your head. We were all dying to tell you finally saw through him. I smiled slightly. What's up? There's a party tonight at the usual spot, 8 o'clock. You better be there. After we hung up, I had to think for a while to remember the usual spot was a bar we used to frequent. Back then, we would all hang out together. Often after getting with Ethan, I hardly went out any. I was once bald and freezes carded, but for love I'd stripped myself of all my edges. I stopped going to malls, and for the first time I learned to shop in discount stores. I gave up wearing luxury brands, carefully choosing inexpensive clothes just so that he wouldn't frown when he saw me. I avoided dining in the places I once loved, and whenever we went out, I'd only eat cheap, fast food with him. I made myself live meekly and cautiously, hoping he'd love me just a bit more. I had once loved him with all my heart. When I arrived at the bar that night, Jerome was thrilled and kept urging me to drink. I didn't refuse, enjoying this long overdue relaxation. These friends were actually good people, especially Jerome. When he got married, he told me to come to him. If Ethan ever mistreated me, he'd make Ethan pay. He even did confront Ethan eventually. It was around the time I got pregnant, a surprise from one night when Ethan came home drunk. I was overjoyed, thinking the child might finally win him over, but when Isabella found out, she deliberately came to my house to provoke me when I couldn't bear it anymore and went to hit her. Ethan came back. He grabbed my wrist and reflexively pushed me away. I fell, hitting my stomach on the table corner, and began bleeding. They rushed me to the hospital. At the time, I was young and strong, not yet worn down by years of misery, so the baby was saved. But Isabella didn't stop. She came over daily to insult me and would call me in the middle of the night just to make me listen to her and Ethan being intimate. Ethan's voice panting, urging her relax. My stomach churned and I barely made it to the bathroom, vomiting violently until tears and bile mixed together when I looked up. The woman in the mirror was so pale, like she could collapse at any moment, her lifeless eyes bloodshot. I lost that baby that day. The doctor told me to rest and avoid emotional stress, but I couldn't control myself. When Ethan heard the baby was gone, he was silent for a long time, and then said there will be other children, but I never had another child. Ethan and Isabella, though, went on to have children of their own. They had a happy family. When Jerome found out, he came over and beat Ethan mercilessly and would have killed him if I hadn't stopped him. As I held Jerome back, he glared at Ethan, yelling, "When you married her, what did you promise? You said you'd treat her well. She used to be so cheerful, and look at what you've turned her into." That time, Ethan didn't fight back. He wiped the blood from his mouth, head down, saying nothing. "What are you thinking about?" Jerome nudged me, raising his glass cheers. I clinked glasses with him and downed my drink. After several rounds, Jerome's face was flushed, and he leaned in, whispering, "You really don't like Ethan anymore." I glanced at him and he immediately looked away, his ears turning pink. I found it amusing. I knew Jerome liked me, but in my last life my eyes were only for Ethan, and I even ended up falling out with Jerome over him. Yet whenever Ethan mistreated me, Jerome would still stand up for me. If I'm going to be with someone in this life, I'd want to be someone like him. Only now do I realize that love alone can't solve everything. Ethan and I came from completely different worlds with different upbringings. We're just worlds apart. He grew up in a family that made him sharp, defensive and distrustful, prickly, sensitive and cold. Meanwhile, I was raised in comfort, cherished like a little princess. My family gave me the confidence to love someone without holding back. But that was also the reason behind my heartbreak. I believed in love conquers all, but I didn't realize that someone like Ethan couldn't be warmed with just passion. I nodded, murmuring, "Yeah, I was blind before." Jerome lowered his head, moving closer and whispering softly, "Then look at me." Before he could finish, someone yanked my wrist, pulling me to my feet. I turned in shock to find Ethan's face twisted in a terrifying expression. His eyes were downcast, his body rigid, and though his voice was calm, it carried an undertone I couldn't understand. "Come with me." I was practically dragged outside by him. "Let go." I pushed him with all my strength. "Are you out of your mind?" But Ethan's grip only tightened, his hold almost painful since his return. He treated me with an unsettling obedience, even something like reverence, but now his dark eyes were intense, his face blank, almost frightening. In a raspy voice, he asked Leona, "What did you just say?" I froze, then gritted my teeth. I said, "I don't like you anymore. I was blind before. You don't like me anymore." He let out a strange laugh, then, grabbing me closer, he stared at me with ice as cold as ice. Say it again for a moment. His stare left me speechless. All that talk about loving me, about staying with me, about never leaving me, was it all a lie? His eyes were wild. I was stunned. Wait, this wasn't right in this life. I hadn't said those things to him yet. I'd said them before we got married. In our past life, I couldn't stop shaking. How did he know? Ethan quickly realized his slip and instinctively took a step back. I whispered, "Ethan, you came back too, didn't you?" He was silent. The midnight wind held around us, dry leaves scraping along the ground. Occasionally a car would pass by, its headlights briefly lighting up the darkness before fading again. "Ethan," I forced a bitter smile, "how dare you?" He had really come back too. After all he'd done in our last life, he'd still dared to say such things to me. Now I'd said those words and I'd met them, but what was the result? I died with regrets in this life. I just wanted to move on, to live well, but he'd torn open my scars all over again, mocking me with the reminder that I could never escape the pain. Ethan was beginning to look panicked. "Leona, let me explain. I was reborn too, but this time I thought it all through. Last time I was a fool, blinded to how much I loved you. Let me make it up to you, Slap." Ethan's face turned to the side. "Ethan, how dare you?" I spat each word with all the hatred I'd stored inside. How dare he, after all that hurt, come to me now saying he'd always loved me? That slap was everything I'd held back, unleashed with all my strength. A thin line of blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. He wiped it away casually, his tone still calm. Was that enough, if not here? He grabbed my hand, pressing it to his cheek, hit me again. "If it'll make you feel better." Even as he said it, his eyes turned red and then tears fell freely. I was shaken. Ethan had never cried in front of me, not even in his worst moments when his father had gambled away his tuition money and came home to beat him up. He hadn't cried the next day when he went to school covered in bruises. Even when he worked 3 jobs, hungry and exhausted to the point of fainting, he hadn't cried. I'd once thought he had a heart of stone, yet here he was, crying in front of me. His tears washed over the blood and his lips, his whole body defeated, hunched over. He pleaded, "Leona, come back to me. If you hate me, you can kill me if you want. Just don't leave me." I felt like I was going crazy. "Ethan, are you out of your mind?" He looked down, his voice shaking. I was so insecure. I was so defensive, thinking everyone was out to hurt me. I didn't dare like you. I couldn't believe you truly liked me. I was scared that one day you'd suddenly tell me I wasn't good enough, that it was all a game to you. Leona, I was an idiot. I deserved all of it. Hit me. Curse me if you want. I'm begging you, just come back. He was sobbing, unleashing every emotion he'd held back. You don't know what it was like after you left. How I lived through those years. I couldn't hold back anymore. A cold laugh escaped me. "Ethan, didn't you love Isabella in our last life? You poisoned me to be with her, didn't you?" Poison. Ethan froze. What poison? You're still pretending I gripped the railing, unsure I could hold myself back from slapping him again. My medicine was switched later. I was recovering at first. But the more I took, the worse I got until I bit down hard on my tongue, the bitterness flooding my mouth. The man I'd loved had killed me for another woman. Even just saying it again was unbearable. I didn't. Ethan burst out. "I never did. I told the housekeeper to take good care of you. How could I have wanted to kill you?" We exchanged a look, realization dawning in both our eyes. If it wasn't him, the only person left close enough to interfere was Isabella. So it had been Isabella who killed me. I was conflicted, but not surprised. Dead was dead. What did it matter who was behind it, even if it wasn't Ethan? Isabella had done it for him, so he couldn't escape the blame. A heavy weariness settled over me, spreading through my body. Love, hate. I was so tired. All I wanted in this life was to stay far away from him and live in peace. Suddenly the rain poured down, soaking Ethan as he stood in the storm, his face wet with what could have been tears or rain. "Leona, please, what about Isabella?" My face was expressionless. You two even had a child in our last life. What's there to say? Ethan was silent for a long time before he finally said hoarsely, "She got me drunk. It only happened that one time." I let out a mocking laugh and said nothing. Ethan looked down even further from the start. "The only one I loved was you." "I never loved Isabella," he continued. Just then, a woman's voice rang out from the shadows. "Then what am I to you?" Isabella stepped out from the darkness. She was wearing that old white dress, soaked and clinging to her Ethan. Her face was blank, but there was a glint of madness in her eyes. If you love her, then what am I all these years I've been by your side? What am I then? Ethan clenched his fists, looking at her with nothing but hatred. Isabella looked like she hadn't been reborn. She was still the same as she was in the last life. She hadn't poisoned me yet, so there was no revenge to take. Ethan understood, saying nothing. Isabella looked startled. Do you hate me, Ethan? Do you really hate me? If you hadn't been manipulating my relationship with Leona, things wouldn't have come to this, he said coldly. Manipulate Isabella, laughed Ethan. She dropped the pretense. If you weren't so insecure and arrogant, how could I have manipulated you? You're the one with a dark heart, wanting her but too afraid to go for it. And now you're trying to pin it all on me. Ethan's temples were throbbing. Leona Isabella tilted her head, her expression innocent and clueless, as if she were just asking a trivial question. You already have everything. Why do you still have to fight with me for Ethan? She didn't seem to need an answer from me and continued talking. You come from a good family. You're beautiful. Everyone surrounds you, loves you, and pampers you. Anything you want, they'll deliver to you without you even asking. So many people like you. Why do you still want to take Ethan away from me? Her voice trembled with barely contained frustration. I only have him. Why do I only have this one person, and you still want to take him away? You already have so much, I answered calmly. Ethan is a person who he likes, is his choice. I can't force him, and besides, I've never won. I lost completely and utterly, is that so? Isabella took a step toward me, and only then did I notice she had been hiding something behind her back. An ominous premonition washed over me, and just as I began to step back, she suddenly pulled out a knife and lunged at me, her face twisted, her eyes wild. If you're dead, Ethan will still be mine. Leona, why are you so happy? You deserve to die. She was too close, and I couldn't dodge in time. Her bloodshot eyes were reflected in my white pupils. Just then, a strong force suddenly pushed me aside. The sickening sound of the blade slicing into flesh was drowned out by the rain, and Isabella stood frozen, staring at Ethan, who was now in front of me, her fingers trembling on the knife's hilt. She stammered Ethan. I stumbled back and turned around. The knife had already sunk deep into Ethan's abdomen. The blood seeped out, turning pink in the rain. He seemed unaware, only smiling faintly at me. As long as you're okay. By the time we got to the hospital, Ethan was unconscious. He had lost too much blood and was immediately rushed into the IQ. Isabella was taken away by the police. It wasn't until the third day that Ethan woke up. I walked into the room and looked at him, feeling 1,000 words stuck in my throat, but I couldn't say a thing. He looked so weak, his face pale as paper, yet he still forced a smile. Leona, you're okay. I felt so conflicted. Why did you take that knife from me? His lashes lowered. I don't know. I just didn't want you to get hurt. Isabella's knife had been aimed directly at my heart. Luckily, Ethan was tall, so it didn't hit anything vital. What are you going to do now? I suddenly asked. Ethan quickly understood my meaning and smiled bitterly. Whatever needs to be done, I'll do it. To be honest, she was your wife in your past life, the one who had your children. I sat on the other bed, he whispered, but she killed you. I fell silent. Ethan coughed a few times, his features contorted with pain for a moment. Then, in a hoarse voice, he said, Leona, I really know I was wrong. I was so ridiculous before, if I could. His voice caught his lips trembling uncontrollably. If I could change, would you? No, I interrupted him. You saved me, but in my past life, I died because of you. Even if you took a knife from me, it doesn't erase the hurt you cost me. His eyes reddened, his teeth clenched tightly as he fought back tears. But Leona, you once said you would love me forever. I suddenly felt exhausted, a bitter smile on my lip. Ethan, love can run out. You spent 10 years wearing down my love, little by little. Ethan's face turned ashen, his panic obvious. Leona, you can't do this. You said you loved me first. Before I turned to leave, I glanced back one last time. Ethan had lost so much weight, and his hospital gown hung loosely on his frame. His brows and eyes still held the features of the boy I had once loved, but his soul had aged. Maybe we did love each other. but the timing was wrong. But now, I whispered, Ethan, I really don't love you anymore. After leaving the room, I could still hear his desperate cries. But Leona, what about me? Why did I go through all of this just to hear that you don't love me anymore? I might as well have died in my past life. I lowered my head, my eyes dry. I couldn't cry anymore because all those tears had already dried up in my past life. I walked away quickly, leaving his cries behind, and in the end I could no longer hear them. Ethan didn't protect Isabella. She was sentenced to 7 years in prison for attempted murder. She was also expelled from the school. I heard that her mother couldn't bear the blow and committed suicide by jumping off a building. I didn't go to the trial, actually. I had already figured out why Isabella hated me so much. Rather than a being for Ethan, it was more about her jealousy. She was jealous of everything I had, so she did everything she could to take Ethan away, trying to prove she could win against me. When she realized she had lost Ethan, she went completely mad. I heard she went insane after hearing the news of her mother's death, her mind completely unraveling, even cursing the judge during the trial. Of course, I was the one who arranged for someone to deliver the news to her. I had also asked my father to make sure Isabella was taken care of in prison. I'd never forgotten what happened in my past life with the poison. She would have to repay her debts. 3 years later, I married Jerome. His family put great importance on the wedding, hosting a grand banquet and inviting all the prominent figures in the city. The event was extremely grand. Just as we were about to take the stage, his secretary suddenly ran over holding an envelope. There was nothing written on it. This envelope contains a check for $2 million. I verified it, and it's real, but there's no name on it. He frowned. What should we do with this? Jerome and I exchanged a look, both of us already guessing who it was from. Ethan certainly had the ability, and despite his first business venture failing, he quickly started over and ultimately succeeded.
He smiled. All since someone is eager to send money, we'll accept it. Just then, my phone suddenly rang.
It was a text message, an unknown number with no greeting or closure, just one sentence. If he treats you badly, come back. I will wait for you forever, Jerome smeared. Let him wait. He won't ever get what he wants in the next life. I deleted the message in front of him, blocking the number as well. Let's go, I smiled at him, linking my arm with his. They're waiting for us, although sad, tearful nights would eventually pass, and I would never look back again. Ethan's perspective when I saw Leona again, I froze. Before me stood 20-year-old, her full of vitality, so alive, completely different from the image of her I had in my memory, which was clouded and lifeless. I couldn't remember how long it had been since I last saw her. I couldn't take my eyes off her, greedily staring. It had been so long since I had seen Leona. When the butler told me she had died in my past life, I didn't believe it until I saw her cold body. It's strange, in that moment I felt nothing. Everything around me disappeared for a few seconds. I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything. It wasn't until they hardly helped me up that I realized I had fallen. I calmly asked the butler, did she leave any messages? The butler shook his head. She didn't say anything. Oh, so she didn't leave a single word for me. Then again, there was nothing left to say between us when she loved me as a young girl. She said all kinds of sweet words. Then we turned against each other and dragged out all the painful memories. She cursed me to die. I called her worthless. What else was there to say? The good and the bad, it was all said and done. It was at that moment I suddenly felt a dull pain in my chest. The pain started off subtle, not very sharp, but soon it spread viciously, drilling through every inch of me. It felt like my heart was being pierced with countless holes, and the pain was so intense that I had to kneel to brace myself. I looked at Leona. She was lying quietly in bed with no reaction whatsoever. If this had happened before, no matter how much we fought, she would have come over to check on me. She was always so silly like that, but this time she wouldn't even spare me a glance. Of course she's dead, completely gone. She will never appear before me again. I thought this, but I wasn't sad. It felt like I was thinking about someone else's problem. My body and mind seemed to belong to someone else, separating me from the heart that was in agony. What should I do? What a hassle, I thought. I still have a meeting tomorrow morning. It will be delayed now because I have to arrange her funeral. Suddenly my throat became itchy and I coughed a few times. That's when I noticed the housekeeper's terrified expression. He hurriedly said, "Sir." I looked down and saw the dark red spots all over my chest. Whose blood is this? I wondered. Then the itch in my throat became unbearable, and I coughed up a mouthful of blood. The housekeeper was frantic, grabbing me and trying to rush me to the hospital, but all I could think was one thing. So this is my blood. After Leona died, I didn't cry like I thought I would. In fact, I even went home and packed some of her things. She didn't have much, considering how much she used to love luxury. The room felt so empty now, with only a few cheap clothes left. It's fine, I thought. After all this time, it's finally over. It wasn't until I opened the wardrobe that I saw a whole shelf of medicinal oils years ago. When I worked delivering takeout, I got into an accident and injured my leg. Every time it rained, the pain would become unbearable. These medicinal oils were specially made by someone she knew at the time. I mocked her for buying so many, and she smiled, her eyes shining, and said, "What if I need them later?" But after we got married, I rarely came home. Whenever I did, it was just more fighting. I had only used these oils a few times, and there was still almost half a bottle left. It suddenly hit me, we actually had good times too. There were times when I thought she was cute, but in the endless arguing and bitterness, we had both become unrecognizable. I suddenly felt something wet and warm on my face. I reached up to touch it. I didn't even realize when I had started crying after Leona died. I didn't forget her as quickly as I thought I would. Instead, she kept appearing in my dreams, almost as if she was trying to torment me. Sometimes it was when we were younger and she would shyly hand me a lunchbox, saying, "Ethan, this was made by my housekeeper. It's the best." It felt strange at the time. I thought she was so arrogant and annoying, but now I suddenly realized that her blushing face was actually very cute. Later, I found out that dish was her favorite. She had wanted to share her favorite thing with me, giving it to me without any reservation, but at that time, I didn't deserve such precious love. A teenager's insecure heart is too sensitive, and I put up defenses, hurting everyone who tried to get close. Leona came from a good family, was beautiful, and had so many people who liked her. I didn't believe she could actually like someone like me who was so worthless. The rich have too many tricks. She must have been playing with me, so I treated her worse and worse. I wanted her to leave. She was like a rare species that had never appeared in my barren, dark world, disrupting everything and leaving me feeling helpless. But I also wanted to confirm her love for me again and again in a despicable way. How pathetic and how hateful. After we got married, our relationship seemed to improve a little, but Isabella kept reminding me that she and I would never belong to the same world. She was right the first time I had money. I eagerly bought her a bag, but it was actually a past season item from a suitor she had in college. What could I possibly have that she would like at that time? I didn't understand my feelings. I thought I truly hated her, but I couldn't help but get closer to her. I kept showing up with Isabella in front of her, sickly, drawing out whatever affection I could. When I saw her hurt look, she cares about me. Later, she appeared in my dreams again, but this time it was different. She was lying on a hospital bed, holding a child I couldn't see clearly, crying in despair. She said, "Ethan, you owe me my child." And I woke up suddenly, unable to sleep the rest of the night. This repeated every day. Sometimes I was happy, other times I was scared. I had to go see a fortune teller. I asked, "Does she have some kind of obsession she can't let go of?" The master looked at me for a long time and sighed. "What she can't let go of isn't her." That day I sat on the mountain for a long time before I understood it turns out the one who couldn't let go was me. It turns out I had fallen in love with her long ago. 3 years after Leona died, I started to lose my mind. I stopped caring about Isabella and the child, letting her go mad. I only coldly said, "It's you who insisted on having this child. It has nothing to do with me." On Leona's birthday, I mixed alcohol with 2 bottles of sleeping pills. To be thorough, I even slashed my wrist. The unbearable pain gradually turned numb. Suddenly, a cool breeze brushed past me. The sunlight was warm, and the sound of birds filled my ears. My hand was suddenly gently held. I turned my head and saw the smiling face of 20-year-old Leona Ethan. She smiled and complained, Why did you take so long to come? I stared at her for a long time, my vision gradually blurring with warmth. Then I slowly turned away and hugged her, squeezing tighter and tighter. She was startled and pushed me away. Why are you doing this? You're hurting me. But then she hugged me back, lightly, laughing. What's wrong with you? Do you miss me? My voice cracked as I answered, Yeah, Leona, I miss you so much. If only I could stay in that moment forever, it would be better than hearing her tell me she didn't love me anymore. In that moment, I finally understood. Getting pierced by 1,000 arrows was nothing compared to this. I lay in bed crying until my voice was hoarse. If it's like this, then why bring me back? I thought I could save her, reverse our tragedy, but I never expected I would lose her completely. My heart ached so much I could barely breathe. I cried and laughed at the same time. I felt like I was going crazy, but I also felt clearer than ever. I finally understood my rebirth was meant for atonement. It was to make me taste the suffering she went through all over again. Death isn't truly leaving now, she has really and truly left me, and my remaining years will be spent trapped in this endless despair with no way to escape the end.